can stop blabbing and introduce Kimberly Stansell Weismantle, who is the Education Director of the Old Davie Schoolhouse Museum.
Thank you very much for having me here today. I grew up in Davie, but I now live in Hollywood, so it's nice to meet you all today. I've been at the Old Davie School since 2013. I actually first found it, even though I grew up in Davie. I had never been there before. I was looking for a wedding venue, so I had my wedding there, and then I interned there, and I have not left. So, because it's fascinating, there's still so much more to find out. Is there a little light for right here?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Because I was like, oh, got my readers. I've really been interested in the history of Davie, what brought people here to South Florida, especially so early on in the 20th century. So I'm going to give you a little bit of history about Davie and then kind of tell you about some of those early families who first arrived here. So if we go back to our very beginnings, we're a part of the Everglades, which is lots of slow-moving water overflowing from Lake Okeechobee. It's a diverse ecosystems of hardwood hammocks, sawgrass prairies, cypress swamps, mangroves. You'll see the overflowing from Lake Okeechobee there. The Tequesta first made their home on the Pine Islands, which was a chain of islands stretching from about where Treetops Park is out west to where the Long Key Nature Center is today. And that's where we get the name for Pine Island Road, is from those Pine Islands. It was the high ground in the area at that time. They made their home there as long as 8,000 years ago. They were doing some road work on Pine Island, and they uncovered a skeleton that they dated to be from 2,000 years ago. So there's all sorts of things that they're expecting to find there as they're getting into some more road work there. Later on, the Seminoles made it their home, and they built cheeky huts, and they traveled the waters in the dugout canoes through all of that area there. Now, technically, the state owned this land, but it was considered to be wasted space. They would call it a pestilence-ridden swamp, but that is where we meet Napoleon Bonaparte Broward, who in 1904 ran for governor of Florida on the platform to drain the useless swamp. And it was successful. He did become our governor. That is where we get the name for our county for today. They wanted to make it available for agriculture. So to do that, they started the drainage project, and that's when they began digging the canals, the canal system that we have today. In 1906, actually July 4th, 1906, they started the project from the New River in Fort Lauderdale. From the New River, it forks. So from the North Fork of the New River, they dug the North New River Canal, and that's what runs along 595. It kind of heads up at an angle, and that was meant to bring in shipping from Central Florida. It met up with another canal, so it was a very active canal, a lane there. Tourists would take boats up through to go to Central Florida that way. From the South Fork of the New River, they dug the South New River Canal, and that's what runs along Griffin Road today. And that was largely meant for draining the land and making it for agriculture. They started this project, and it very clearly made a tremendous change in the Everglades, and change that is irreversible today and still is something that they're working on perfecting out here. It would change the Everglades forever. This is the South New River Canal. This is what runs along Griffin Road. Now, it was a difficult process, and the state ran out of money doing that, so that's when they started selling the land inexpensively to developers. And one of those developers, I'm sorry, I skipped this one. This is where you can kind of see those canal systems here from Lake Okeechobee. Here's that North Fork of the New River, the South Fork here. And so the area we're going to be talking about today is right in between the two canals there. But we do meet R.P. Davie, and that's where we get the namesake for our town from. R.P. Davie was a sugar beet farmer. It was a millionaire sugar beet farmer from Colorado, and he had an interest in irrigation projects all over the country. So he was a part of forming 3 different companies: the Everglades Land Company, the Everglades Land Sales Company, and the Everglades Sugar and Land Company. And it's very aggravating that they're basically all the same name, but they all did different things at different times, but they're all fell under Davie involvement there. And they purchased 28,000 acres of land in South Florida. And the agreement was that they would continue digging those canals and making it habitable for people in that area. So what his companies did is they started an experimental farm. It was a 10-acre tract of land where they could demonstrate what could grow, what couldn't grow here very well. They sent out advertisements all over the world inviting people here to this farmland, and people came from all over. From Fort Lauderdale, you could get a free boat trip from Fort Lauderdale for the day. The realty companies were offering these free trips. They'd have speakers on the board the ships who would tell you all about the Everglades. They would have music on board. They'd encourage you to come out, take your tour, and then you would tour the Davie farm. And here you see a group there looking at a tractor there over on the right side. The company even built a hotel so that if you wanted to stay the night, you were encouraged to stay the night. You could buy your property the next day. And this hotel, I think, was built as the first permanent structure in Davie. It was built in 1911, and it is actually still there today. It's on the corner of 65th and Griffin. It was originally the hotel, it was a restaurant. We'll talk about the women's club, used it as their clubhouse for a while. It was a barber shop, and then it was private apartments. It's recently been privately purchased by a private owner, and we're hoping to work on them to maybe restore it to something that we could recognize today and use for as a part of our history of Davie. So Davie might be the namesake for the town, but a lot of people knew it first as Zona. And that name comes from some of the first families who arrived there came from the Panama Canal Zone. There were Americans who were working on that project. When their contracts were finishing up, they bought land here together and they formed the Zona Glade Company. So it's kind of interchangeably, they would call it Zona, they would call it the Davie Farm, they'd call it the Davie Tract. And we're going to talk more about Zona in just a little bit. But in 1914, they did officially name the town Davie. They voted on it in 1914. Zona was too close to another town named Ozona, and mail was getting misdirected, so that's officially one of the reasons why they chose the name Davie. But the town didn't incorporate officially until 1925. They met at the Davie School and held a meeting upstairs, about 200 residents, and they voted for incorporation, and that is when they elected Frank Sterling, the first mayor. So we're celebrating our 100th anniversary along with Hollywood as well. But like I said, they elected Frank Sterling, the first mayor, and he had worked as a horticulturalist for the state, and he would travel around researching and inspecting for citrus canker. He had visited Davie and bought land very early on, so it was early in 1911, but he didn't move his family there until 1924. When he did, they shipped in coquina rock from St. Augustine to build their house, and so that's what you can see at the top there, and that house is also still on Davie Road today. It's part of a growers, Highland Growers, their land there, and if they're outside, I stop by and I'm like, everything okay? You guys keeping the house? Okay, good. Making sure they're, again, we be very careful with the private owners, just making sure they know what they have, so. But that's our Frank Sterling. He, actually I'll go back real fast. He served on the State House of Representatives for a term, and unfortunately he passed away in 1949. He died of cancer, and only a week later they renamed the Davie Dania Road after him, which is Sterling Road that we have today. So it was only a week after he passed that he had played a large role. He basically was president of everything at the time, very involved in the community, and helped get a lot of the orange groves started here at that time. But if we go back to the beginning again, we're going to go back to those early 1910s when families first began arriving here. Again, this is the South New River Canal that you see here. And I want to share a few of the background of those families. How did they find out about the land that was for sale here? Why did they come, and then why did they stay? Because a lot of families came, they stayed for a season, and then they left. It wasn't for them. So what made them stay here in South Florida? So we're going to start with, the three families are the Earls, the Vealeys, and the Walshes. The Vealey and the Walsh house have both been moved to the Davie School campus. So if you've been to the old Davie School, those are the two houses that sit at the back of our property. And we'll talk a little bit more about those later. But we'll start with the Earls. The Earls, Harry Earl was born in New York, but by 1906 he had signed on to work as a part of the Panama Canal project. He signed on as a carpenter. He would marry Adolpha Lawrence, She's a little bit harder to find information about. What we have is mostly from the family, which is a big problem with women's histories. It's harder to track the paper trail of a lot of women's experience through the years. But we know that she was born in Panama. Her family, they were a Catholic family. Her mother was from Spain. Her father was from Italy. So I don't know if she would have considered herself to be Panamanian. So, but they were living in Panama, born in Panama. She was from, the family says she was a bookkeeper for the Panama Canal Project, which is likely where they met. And they married sometime between 1906 and 1911. We know more about Harry because we can track his service record with the Panama Canal Project. So here you can see he signed on in September of 1906 is when he sailed to Panama. He started as a carpenter. His salary was 65 cents an hour there. It tells us he was from New York there. But it also tells us, or we can also find out how he learned about Davie, about the land in South Florida, by looking through the newspaper records. In the Panama Canal, they had the Canal Record, which was an English printed newspaper for the people working on the canal, and had updates about the canal project, how much they had dug that week, that month, what was projected. They had sports teams and all of the updated information there on the drama clubs that they had. It also tells us that they had an illustrated lecture on the Everglades of Florida in February of 1911, and that was presented by E.C. Howe, who was actually he was a sales agent for the Everglades Land Sales Company. So he worked for Davie's company. And so now here we find him in Panama giving a presentation on the Everglades, which would have been a big scrapbook of pictures that people could look through and see what the farm looked like. And sometime after that, we know that Harry Earl and a few other people from the Canal Project at the time purchased their land together as a group. And Harry would serve as the manager for the group, kind of overseeing the project. And we'll get back to that in a minute. So we do know he purchased his land. If we go back to his service record here, we follow through the years, and it says that he got a raise. He was 68 cents an hour. He was a clerk, which is likely where he would have met Adolpha if she was a bookkeeper at the time. But here on May 24th, 1911, he took 42 days leave with pay, which ended with his resignation. So where was he on May 24th, 1911? We can actually follow him here in a manifest. This came from the Ellis Island records, and you can see this is the manifest list, and here are Harry and Adolpha Earl listed here. They were also joined on this, on their ship, would travel from Panama all the way to New York. So they skip right past Florida, which is where they were intended to go, but there was no immigration port here in South Florida, so they had to go all the way through New York. And on board with them were Adolpha's sister, who is Christina Zanetti right here, and her three daughters, Anna Zanetti, Kermia Zanetti, and Elida Hendricks, who had married another American man, Clarence Hendricks, right here. And I introduced those three daughters, Kermia, Anna, and Elida, because Anna Griffin, here on the right, or Anna, I gave it away, Anna Zanetti would go on to marry Al Griffin, who was from Kentucky, had moved to the area with his family, and Anna Zanetti and Al Griffin were the first married couple in Zona in 1913. They would go on to have 8 kids. They would have 2 girls and 6 boys. Al Griffin, he built a houseboat for the family to travel along with him on the canal. He was a surveyor, later a carpenter, so he'd bring the family with him as he traveled. But unfortunately, Al and Anna were killed in a car accident. They were hit by a drunk driver in 1937. One of the daughters adopted all 6 of her brothers so that the family could stay together. They actually still lived on that houseboat, but it had been dry docked. It had been pulled up to land, and that's where the family all moved in together again. They were killed on Broward Road, which would be renamed to Griffin Road in 1955. The eldest daughter, she said she found out about it the same way that everybody else did in the newspaper, that they had named it after the family. There had been a member, somebody from the Davie who was on the county commissioners, and he had suggested their name for that. that road. So now we have Sterling Road and Griffin Road. Now you know where those come from. But back to the manifest. We're not done here yet. Over in the scribbly parts, which is very difficult to see here, but if you were to look very closely, you could decipher that it says that Anna, Christina, and Kermia were joining their son-in-laws, Harry Earl and Clarence Hendricks, to Dania. So they were on their way to Dania. And we do know that they arrived in Dania likely by train. And so this is the Dania Railroad Station there. And when they arrived in 1911, this is what Dania would have looked like. A little bit more of an established town, since this was our first town incorporated in Broward County. And we know they arrived by June of 1911 because Adolpha gave birth to her son. So during all of that travel, she was 8.5 months pregnant, traveling by boat from Panama to New York and then by railroad all the way south, and had her son on June 28th, 1911, Harry A. Earl, Harry Adolpho Earl, just to make it clear for everyone that they're all related there. And so he was born and raised in Davie. He served in World War II, and we're going to talk a little bit more about him a little bit later. But we knew from Dania that they made their move onto their Everglades land, and Harry Earl established a store there. It was kind of like a boarding house, a mercantile store, a hotel for kind of anybody arriving at that time as well. It was known as Zona Inn by one instance, so it's kind of hard to track down if that's what they called it or if that's what the newspaper called it that day. But that's where they formed the Zona Glade Company. And you'll see that here with Harry Earl as that manager. So the Zona Glade Company growing tomatoes on their farmland. And we know what those early years were like because Harry Earl published the experience in The Country Gentleman, which was a popular magazine at that time. And he wrote a lot about that experience here. He described the land when they first arrived here, which is still being drained by those canals. It's not entirely ready for you to walk on and farm. You still need to prepare that land. He said, imagine a lake of muck 10 acres in extent and from 3 to 4 feet deep. When a man walked on it, he sank 3 or 4 inches or more. A horse, mule, or ox sank to the belly and was worse than helpless. So on this farmland that they have, all of this land, 700 acres that they need to farm, they needed to transport the manure that they had to bring by either carrying it themselves or wheeling it in a wheelbarrow on planks that they had laid out across acres and acres of land. So it was not easy work that they were doing. And all of that actually came with more expenses than they were prepared for. They needed a different kind of manure than what they had budgeted for. So it was a big problem that ate up a lot of their funds that they had that first year. They raised tomatoes, potatoes, peppers, and eggplants at that first season, but it did not make it to the market because there was a very severe winter. It got below 30 degrees from that winter in 1911, and it destroyed the crop before they could harvest it. So he wrote that it was a very serious setback to our enthusiasm for Florida farming. So they basically, with what money that they had left over, they used that to buy more seed, hire more help, and bring in more fertilizer for the spring market to try again. And unfortunately, that was the rainiest season on record. It flooded just when they were getting ready to harvest that second crop. So their whole first year basically had been wiped out. The drainage canals, they were incomplete, and the water sat for 2 months from 6 inches to 2 feet deep. So it pretty much wiped out what they had come with. He wrote that during this time, maiden cane, watergrass, took complete possession of the cultivated land. The fertilizer we had provided for the crops gave great assistance to this growth. So all that fertilizer they had paid for was great for the plants taking over their farmland. But you wonder, why would you stay through all of these different difficulties? And he's quoted here in the little underlined part that to stay or not to stay was the great question among those who could choose. As for ourselves, it was stay. For financial reasons, we were unable to go anywhere else. So basically, they didn't have the money to leave. They had invested in the land, and so they stuck it out for another season. And by 1914, they did get a return on that land. In 1914, he wrote that they had to finish their education in Florida here and how to farm on this land. So this is from 1914, tells us a little bit more about his success in Davie at the time. And Harry Earle was listed among the literary folk at the time. He would continue publishing these articles, and he was a botanist, and so he was raising plants from a scientific standpoint, and he developed a black pansy. So they were trying all different kinds of things out on their farmland here. He would go on to serve as a commissioner on the Davie Sub-Drainage Board, and he passed away in 1940, age 67. And Adolpha Earle, she lived to be 96, remaining in the area with her family during that time. Their son, Harry Earle, he continued in that family's tradition of community service. He was a part of the Chamber of Commerce, and this is a great little essay that he wrote for the second annual Orange Festival, which is our Orange Blossom Festival that we have every year today. Started in 1941, but 1942, the United States had just entered World War II. And so this little essay is all about the Davie spirit and helping out during that wartime effort. He was a part of establishing the Central Broward Drainage District. And really, both him and his father were working towards helping with the drainage in South Florida and restructuring that canal system. And he passed away in 1984 at 73. So there was a little bit of scientific, a little bit of an adventure there from that family. We'll go to the Walshes and the Vealeys. We tell their story together because Mrs. Walsh and Mrs. Vealey were sisters. Charles and Catherine Walsh they were married in 1886 in Iowa, and Harry and Helen Vealey were married in 1892 in Georgia, and they would have one son. His name was Harry, everybody's named Harry. His name is not Harry. Charles Edward Vealey, and so they would have their one son as well. But to start with Charles Walsh, he was a lawyer in Iowa, Illinois, and New York. But by 1896, he was serving as the secretary for the Democratic National Committee. And so he was very active in politics at the time. But he did take a detour in 1898 to go to the Alaskan gold rush in the Klondike. And so this is reports that he was bound for Alaska. His wife, Catherine, did not go. She remained in Iowa. But she would submit his letters and stories to the newspaper so we can kind of follow along what he did during that time. And so this is a report of his kit, what he purchased for his trip there, all of the different clothes that he needed for the journey. It was said to be a fastidious dresser, trading his blue overalls for a red, my goodness, not enough coffee today, guys. He was a fastidious dresser. He was trading for blue overalls and a red handkerchief here. You can kind of follow along how there's different ways you could get to the Klondike. He was traveling to Dawson City here. He traveled this red route, which meant that he traveled partly by boat, partly by dog sled. And from those reports and those letters, they were very difficult to travel. Some stories were that the boat would sink one of the times. Another one, the ice broke and two men on in their party drowned, and it was not an easy trip, but he would make it. And he served in the, here's a little picture of him, a little drawing of him that was published in the Boston Globe here. So you can see him in front of his tent. But he made it to Dawson City, and he served as the editor for the Klondike Miner. And that's actually what you can see right here. Would have been his office there in Dawson City, the printing office. He served as the editor for that magazine, and they would publish stories of the social and business activities, and also a lot of criticism for the gold rush at that time too. But he did travel back and forth between there and Chicago to continue with his political pursuits, and so he finally did return to Chicago by 1900. He continued on with that, and by 1906, he left the committee. He's quoted remarking that the corrupt corruption and slavish subserviency of the individual to party name. And he would join on by 1908 with William Randolph Hearst, and so who was known for his newspaper empire there. He had a failed presidential and mayoral run, and so now he formed his own party, It's like history repeating itself, if you know. But so he formed his own party, the Independence Party, where Walsh was the secretary. And in discussions of who they would nominate as their presidential nomination, they suggested our Charles Walsh. You see, his name came up in that discussion there. So we just, sometimes we have this little house in the back that we see every day, and you don't realize that all of this background that he had experienced before he made his move here. Because why would he move to South Florida? All of these adventures he's going on. But he was a part of an advisory committee for a National Farmland Congress. So it was a big week-long convention where they would bring in prospective land owners to learn about the farming possibilities around the country. So all over, if you had a possibility for farming, you can come and present there. And one of the presentations was by Napoleon Bonaparte Broward, who he came and he spoke about the land available in South Florida at the time. And the Miami metropolis reported that immediately following his address, several sales of Florida land were made in the auditorium. And so we know this is where they crossed paths at that time. And Walsh even visited South Florida. He toured the land. He made his purchase with the Everglades Land Sales Company, so again, one of those Davie companies here. And the metropolis wrote that if there's any man in the world who ought to be in a position to select the best land, either from the standpoint of a home or an investment, Mr. Walsh is that man. Clearly, he'd done his homework at that time. He also purchased land for his brother-in-law, and so here's where it mentions he bought 40 acres of land for his brother-in-law, Harry Veely. Like I said, everybody's named Harry. It's very confusing, but here we see Harry Veely. We're switching to the other side of the family now. He was a painter in the early years. He was a sign painter in Kansas. This is the sign that you see on the top right there, came from after they were moving the house, they found that on the grounds, and so somebody returned it to us. Bob Carr, who's the archaeologist, he did a survey of the site. He found it and donated it to us so we could have it. And my best guess is that it was painted by Harry Veely. He has that experience, and it looks like some of his work there. But Veely spent considerable time in Kansas when it was a frontier state. He also saw much of the life in the state of Washington when there was only one brick building in Seattle. So he was traveling throughout the country during that time. He married Helen Maxon in 1892. And like I said, they would have their one son in Seattle. What brought them from Kansas to Seattle? There's one reference to that they invested in a trout farm in Seattle. I don't think it took off. It didn't last very long. There's only one mention of it, but that's what brought them to Seattle. We follow them again. The 1900 census, they're in Seattle. By 1910, they're in Chicago. But in between those years, they actually were living in Colombia, South America. I'm not sure what brought them there, but we have an oral history from Ed Veely, their son, and he says that his father worked there for 5 years during that time, and he and his mother went and lived there for 2 years too. So they traveled a little bit to Colombia, and then they came back to the up north. And when they were in the cold, wintry Chicago, Harry began having the bronchial problems, and his doctor literally prescribed him Florida. You needed that humidity that they had been familiar with in South America, and so they picked Florida from that land purchased by his brother-in-law. So they made their move to South Florida in between 1911 and 1912. Helen and Charles Edward, they stayed in a hotel in Fort Lauderdale, but Harry Veely, he rented a room in the general store, and that's the building that you see right here. This general store was built right on the edge of the South New River Canal. This is that hotel I mentioned earlier, kind of in the background here. I suspect he didn't get one there because he wasn't a prospective buyer. He already bought his land, so he didn't get to stay in the nice hotel. He had to stay in the general store, where he rented a room while they started building their home. And their home was top of the line modern at the time, a $3,000 home in the Glades. And of course, all of the supplies would need to be shipped down the canal. All of the materials, all of the labor came from the down the canal. And you'll see that the building is under construction here. And this picture actually came from the Everglades magazine, which was like a supplemental magazine that was included in newspapers that was published by Davie's company, the Everglades Land Sales Company. And so that was included a lot in those the updates of the home. Both of these pictures actually came from that magazine. Here you'll see Harry and Helen Veely, and I think that's Ed on the porch there. This house looks a little bit different than when it was first completed, as you see here when it's completed. And then here what it looked like after the 1926 hurricane took off that original roof. They were able to save the rest of the house because it was deeply, had the foundation down to the rocks. And so the house was secure, but the roof blew off. And they rebuilt it with the hip style roof that you see here today. And that's on the house currently. Now the Walshes followed shortly after. In 1914, they built their home that they called Orange Villa, and they ordered their house from a catalog. And Sears is the most popular brand, but we can never place this style house with any of the Sears catalogs, so we started looking for outside vendors, and it turns out it's an Aladdin style home, which is another company in the area. Is anybody familiar with the Aladdin homes? There's an area in Homestead where the Aladdin company wanted to establish like a show neighborhood of all of their homes. So they started building all the different, or they laid out the plat for the town to be the Aladdin neighborhood. And so there's cross sections there that's like Alibaba Lane and Scheherazade Road. But that 26 hurricane pretty much wiped out everything and they stopped building. So those roads are there. So in the middle of nowhere Homestead or Alibaba Lane and Scheherazade Road, but there's nothing around it to lead you why, but it came from this Aladdin company. But they bought the Georgia #1 model, and it cost them $839, which would be about $12,000 today, or between $12,000 and $21,000 today. But they did have to finish the construction and pay for the land there. They did add on an extension here to the left side, or to the east side here, which is today our sunroom, and later on a kitchen to the back as well. Both families went into the citrus business, which Mr. Walsh was told would be impossible in the Everglades land, but they proved that wrong. The Veelys started Veely Groves, which was one of the longest running groves in Davie. It didn't close until 1996, and here you see the roadside stand here from the 1990s. And then the Walshes formed Wasico Groves, which stands for Walsh Citrus Company. And they operated that, the land was sold after the flooding in 1947. They sold their land to Morris Cooper, who would later go on to form Cooper City on their old farmland. So, unfortunately, let's see. We get to Catherine and Helen. I did not forget about them. They're a very important part to our stories here. Like I said, they were sisters. They grew up together. They had two brothers, Charles Edward, which is where Helen's son gets his name, and William. Their father's name was John, and he was working for the railroad by the time they were married, but he originally started off looking through the census records. He was a clerk, a domestic servant, and then later on worked for a manager for the railroad. So you could tell there was a drastic change during those about 30 years of that early family there. They were not sure exactly what their education was at the time. The census records do say that they did go to school, but we do know that education was very important to them. This is from 1907, and it was Mrs. Walsh was involved in the CLSC. Is anybody familiar with the Chautauqua Literary and Scientific Circle? It's still an active organization today. It was like by mail at the time, but a book club that was promoted adult education. And so they would assign like 6 books, and you would write your response and send it in. And so we have one of a copy of her responses to the readings for that session that they had. They also were a part of the 1919 Study Club, which is involved in people from Fort Lauderdale, Hollywood, all over actually were a part of this. And they would have meetings bi-weekly where they would assign readings that you would perform a reading of a play, you would read an essay, they would give out assigned sessions, like they would have a meeting on Russia, and you get assignment, you're going to give a talk on the topography of Russia, you're going to give a talk on the politics, on the music of Russia. The bottom one here is about assignments from South America, and so Mrs. Veely gave a presentation of all the baskets she had brought back with her from their time living in South America. So it was a chance for the communities to come together and learn together as well. They also were involved in a lot of philanthropic groups. So they were involved before they even moved here as the Philanthropic Educational Organization, the PEO. And so this is a little newspaper article about an event that they held at their home, at the Walsh's home. Mr. Veely's not listed here because this lines up with about the time that he's building a house in South Florida, so he did not attend this particular event. But one of my favorite resources in these old newspapers is if they post the address, because then I go to Google search, I go to Google Maps, and I see if that house is still there. And sometimes you get very lucky, and so I did actually, their house where this event was at was available online. I think I went to property records for this one. Sometimes I get a little snoopy and I gotta find them all. But I think it's interesting to see the house because it looks so familiar. It looks so much like the one that they built here in South Florida as well. They continued on with their philanthropy here. They were very involved in establishing the Broward County Federation of Women's Clubs, so bringing together all the small groups from all these small towns in Broward together to form the federation that would work together for projects like establishing a home for a rest home for the elderly. This one was established in Dania at the time. And if you notice right here, if you see up at the top, Miss Ivy Stranahan was involved as well in this federation here. Mrs. Walsh was the first president. They would organize this club with the suffrage leagues, with the women's Christian temperance unions in the area, which they also established in Davie. They organized the Suffrage League and the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And these two clubs had a lot in common. They were both working for women's suffrage, women's right to vote. But the Women's Christian Temperance Union had the additional that they were working for prohibition. And I think it's interesting when we line up like the list of names is that a lot of people were in, you either in both or you were in just the Suffrage League, which I think tells you a little bit about what they thought about prohibition at the time. So I'm not saying they're complete lists, but it gives us a hint of who might have been involved in enjoying alcohol during that time. This meeting on the right, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, they actually held at the Davie School in April of 1918 before it was completed. It says it was held in a new school auditorium, which is almost completed. It officially opened in May of 1918. So right before it opened, the Women's Christian Temperance Union was having a meeting there in our auditorium upstairs. And like I said, they were involved in the Federation of Women's Clubs and establishing the Davie Women's Club, which was organized in 1922. They would first hold their meetings at the school, but they eventually purchased their own clubhouse, which is that hotel that we had mentioned at the beginning. They closed in the front here as more space, and they organized the first library in town. You'll see the sign above the door says library. In 1947, when there were great flooding in the area at the time, people, when their homes were flooded, brought their books to the women's club to be stored upstairs so that they weren't destroyed in the floodwaters at the time. Yeah. And you can see the house is built a little bit up to as well, so water didn't quite get into the house, thankfully. The women's club, they did shortly after, they had just broken ground right before that flood, so it took a while to finish their clubhouse, but they finished it in 1948. And you'll see the women's club as it stands on Orange Drive today, and it's still an active organization as well. Catherine and Helen were very involved in establishing the first Methodist congregation there. The church first met in a wooden school building that was built before our Davie School was built. It had 2 classrooms, and they would meet with a Methodist group on one side and Baptists on the other, and they'd try to out-sing each other. But eventually, being a small community, they joined together and established the Methodist congregation that is there, the Methodist Episcopal organization. And by 1926, right before that 26 hurricane, finished constructing this building, and of course they needed furniture for it. And this is just a neat little story that was written by the minister at the time about the history of the Davie Community Methodist Church. While they were building a new Methodist church in Fort Lauderdale, Mrs. Veely and Mrs. Walsh swung on into the minister there and said, "Hey, don't you want new furniture for your brand new church building?" And they said, and he's like, "Well, maybe." And he's like, "Well, we'll take your old stuff." So they collected all of the old furniture, loaded it up, and brought it to the church in Davie. So that's how they got their furniture for that first year. Now, unfortunately, Catherine Walsh was killed rather tragically. She was on her way to a women's club meeting in Fort Lauderdale, and her car was hit as it crossed over the railroad crossing. But it made front page news at the time. She was a very well-known and well-loved community member. And Charles Walsh passed away only about 2 months later in December. He had a stroke in his home. And this is a little note from Ivy Stranahan to Clyde Walsh, who was their nephew, who took over the Groves in their home at the time, just about saying that he'll be a well-missed member of the community. The Vealeys, they did continue on in Davie with many construction projects. They built a 2-story packing house that was used for social events and storing of fruits and vegetables before they went to Fort Lauderdale. He helped establish the Davie Telephone Company, and then he passed away in 1946 at 87. And Helen, only a few years later, after many years being active in many organizations, did she pass away in 1950. Their son, Ed Vealey, he served in the Navy in World War I, and he would go on to serve in World War II as well. He was the air raid warden for Davie at that time. They were afraid that the canals would be targeted by enemy planes during World War II, and so the Army encouraged them to build this watchtower that was manned 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It was manned by women and children during the day and men at night, and they would call in any time that planes would be flying over to call those planes in. And there were many planes at the time because there was an Army, or there was a Naval Air Force base, or a naval airfield in the area at the time, which is actually where Nova Southeastern is today, is on the old World War II airfield there. But this is Ed Vealey in the corner here, working in that as a plane spotter at that time. And then again, you'd wonder why all these people would come to Florida, what their plans were while they were here. And it's really like the Walshes, they came for a new path away from the politics and agriculture, and the Vealeys came for their health and new opportunities. The Earls came for the new opportunity and to raise their family in the United States again. And all of these families came and they stayed. They became very involved. They were active members in the community, and they helped lay the foundation for the town. And so here we see, this is most of Davie. You'll see that South New River Canal through the middle here. Here's Griffin Road and Orange Drive. This is after that flood in 1947. You can see this is all floodwaters over here. But right here is our school, built in 1918. This is the original location of the Walsh house. I actually think I got circles right here. And then right over here, right off of the picture is where the Vealey house would have been located. It's actually right off of Vealey Road. When you drive down Griffin, you'll notice the family names on the road there of who was farming on that corner. And most of those names remain on those roads. But over here we have the town hall. The women's club is right over here. To the back, underwater, is the rodeo arena. We didn't even get into the rodeo history today because that's a whole other hour we could talk about. We have the rodeo history here. Was an open air arena until the 80s, so it's just underwater there at the time. But this is just a few of the families who came those early years. There were lots of other stories that we would like to tell. We have a few of them coming on up. Where are you going to come? Let's see. No, you're not going to do it. Well, all the different families. We have the Stoddards, who established there were beekeepers in Davie. We have the Sars, who came from Estonia and Norway. There were families who, to survive during the Depression and during Prohibition, established stills on their farms. So there's all sorts of these stories of how families came to Davie and how they survived there. But at the Davie School, we're always looking to learn more and tell those family stories here. And here you'll see this is the Vealey house. At our campus today, the Walsh house on the right here, our beautiful Davie School at the top. We do have a lot more history that is included in a book that we have here that I wrote during COVID because I had nobody to talk to. So it's 196 images of Davie, and it starts from the beginning through the Everglades all the way through the 80s, or through the 60s and 80s, 70s, 80s at the end. And I do have some available for sale here, but it's available from our school, from Amazon. I always recommend the soft cover. The hard cover, the Amazon prints, and it's not as good, so get that soft cover. And the quality of the pictures aren't great. And then local bookstores available at Barnes & Noble. And we have events that are coming up. Every third Saturday of the month is Step Back in Time Saturdays. So you get to come and do all of those chores, wash laundry by hand, write with the dip pen in the classroom, squeeze orange juice. We do different stuff every monthly. On the second Thursday of the month, we have an open mic night, which has been a full house the past 2 months, which has been a lot of fun. We do work with a group that do a walking ghost tour. That starts at our school, goes over to the women's club and back, and it's more of a comedy. It's a lot of fun. We have our Tea with Barbie, which people of all ages are welcome to come. We have a tea with our volunteers who are all a variety of Barbies there. Summerween, we like to kick off Halloween a little early, so we start in August with our Halloween event. And then October 25th, I'll have a walking tour, which will take us through this downtown area. And it's about 2 hours, but less than a mile, and we'll hit about 10 or 11 different spots in downtown Davie there. So all of that is on our website there. So thank you all very much for having me today. I hope I didn't talk too much, but if anybody has any questions or anything, I'd love to.
The picture of the schoolhouse is still up on the stilts. Does it flood there still?
Thank you so much. You're so sweet. Thank you very much. So our schoolhouse it has been graded in some, so it's not lifted up. We do have like a crawl space underneath. So thankfully, knock on wood, it doesn't flood it into the building, but it does get wet outside.
But you can still see those stilts like that picture you have there? That one.
Oh, the houses, yes, the 2 houses, yes, those are built lifted up. Yes, they are underneath.
You still get high water there?
Underneath, not into the house, though. Yeah, never that high. Yes.
I know you said you could say an hour about Bergeron, but I was wondering if you might share maybe 2 minutes of interesting stuff about Bergeron.
About the rodeo? Well, so the rodeo was established, wherever there's cows and cowboys, there's going to be a rodeo. And so there had been unofficial rodeos for as long as families had been looking for entertainment. The first official rodeo, I put down as at 1941, the first Orange Festival, the Orange Blossom Festival. It brought a lot of attention. 1942, they continued after the United States entered World War II. They did hold that event and dedicated it to the war effort, but they didn't hold it for 3 years after that. And when they came back in 1946, they knew that the rodeo would be popular, but they had to turn away like thousands of people. This tiny community of less than 2,000 people, they were having 20,000 people trying to attend the rodeo. So it was a little too much at the time, but they spent the next year upgrading the rodeo, building better seating, establishing a ticketing system. And so from 1947 on, that's really been the Davie Rodeo through those years. It was owned by the Chamber of Commerce, and then the town purchased it, and they were going to turn it into baseball fields. The plan was to move the rodeo somewhere else from the downtown area. They're going to move the rodeo, but people knew that if you tear it down, and there wasn't an exact plan already in place, we might not get a rodeo again. So people protested, rode their horses to town hall, and they protested to keep the rodeo, and the town did. So it is a town site, a town facility, and it's maintained by the town. They, to have the size of rodeos that we have, you needed to purchase the land next to it to maintain it. And unfortunately, the town didn't have the means at the time to purchase that additional plot of land, and that's where Bergeron stepped in and purchased that side, the land that we needed there for additional parking and events.
When was
and
that?
space.
What year was that?
In the 80s, I want to say, but I don't know the exact year, but that's where he came in. And so we wouldn't have the rodeo today with the kind of level of events that we have there if we didn't have that property. Yes.
I was just going to add that the walking tour, we've been on that.
Yeah.
Great, and brings all of this stuff to life.
Absolutely.
You're standing right in front of it.
Absolutely. You get to walk right in front of it. And I mentioned with the Hollywood that you have the book as well. We bring the pictures so you can see what the building looked like before and what it looked like today, because they're all for different uses as well too. But yes.
Can you talk a little bit about Flamingo Gardens?
So Flamingo Gardens was established, they bought their land after that 26 hurricane when the land was very inexpensive. They were able to purchase a lot of land for not as much as inexpensively, and so they established the groves there. It was the Rays and the Hammersteins. Wasn't the Hammersteins as well were involved with that? The Rays, Hammersteins, and Frank Sterling actually served as the first manager for the groves. So they had the botanical side, and then they had the citrus as well. They established Flamingo Road they built it as a road for Flamingo Groves. to move the citrus out to either the Griffin Canal or the North Canal. Because there wasn't a well-established road at the time. So that's why we have Flamingo Road, it's because of Flamingo Road, the Groves. And it's a beautiful place still today. And so very thankful that they're protecting that house they have there.
When was the Davie School built and what grades were being taught in
It was built in 1918 is when they officially opened, and it was there were 90 students on the first day. It taught from the first grade all the way to the 8th grade. There was no high school at the time, so Fort Lauderdale was the nearest, or Dania High School were the nearest at the time. And it was 3 teachers that first year, and with 90 students. So you'd pack about 30 kids in each room and split the grades as you needed. So you might have 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, 4th and 5th, and then 6th, 7th, and 8th, depending on the needs for the time. Yes.
You know, the Western theme of Davie,
Yes.
was that because of the rodeo? Is there any official sponsorship of that, or did it just happen?
So I'm fascinated, and if you've been on my walking tour, I go a little bit more into that. So the rodeo, it was started as like an agricultural community, and the kind of the rural aesthetic of it being maintained brought in a lot of people with the equestrian history there. So there was actually a movie director in the 60s who he had a studio that he established there, and he went to the Chamber of Commerce at the time and said, if you build your downtown as a Western style downtown, I'll film my movies there, and then you can use it as like a tourist attraction when I'm not filming. And the town was like, why would we do that? If we were any closer to any further east, we'd be in the ocean. Like we're not Western. Like, that's a silly thing. But I think that idea percolated through the years of let's make the downtown a Western theme. We do have a rodeo. I think that timed into the 60s being a big time for the cowboy Westerns were so popular then. So it just kind of built on itself. And so it wasn't until the 80s that they established like an ordinance for the town that if you're building on Davie Road, you would have to build it with a Western style front to it. And the owners were like, why? I don't want to. The wood rots. We're in South Florida. Termites are going to eat it up. And what do you mean by Western? And Irv Rosenbaum, who was the town administrator at the time, said, well, the type of Western that is presented to us in the movies. And so it was kind of mishmash of what that meant for what movie you were watching, And the town finally narrowed it down to Colorado 1888. So that was the official style. But you can kind of see when you go down Davie Road, some buildings are, some buildings aren't. Right now it's going through a big revitalization, and so it's more coming together as a cohesive look. But that's why it was never a perfect one-to-one across the whole place, and it's kind of people brought to it what they wanted to bring to it. So like they built a new McDonald's that went all in Western with a corral to the back, and it was very popular for a long time that you could ride your horse there and tie it up at the corral. But the little hardware store across the street didn't want to invest thousands of dollars into changing the front of their business that had already been there for 40 years. So there's a lot of interesting going through the newspapers discussion about it. So that's one of my favorite things to talk about too. So.
When I was in high school, we used to go out there and go horseback riding. That was the only place you could rent a horse. Mm-hmm. And it was on an old airstrip, if I remember correctly.
Yes, and so that's where Nova Southeastern is now. Oh, it was called Foreman Field, and so during World War II, it was used to be the Foreman's Dairyland, but they made it as a wagon wheel shaped airfield, and they used it during the wartime. And then after the war, it had to be used for education purposes, but it was kind of abandoned for a while. They didn't know what that meant. It was used for drag racing a lot out there. It was very popular. You could bag a bunch of rattlesnakes on the airfield. People riding their horses out there, of course, would always go through there. But it wasn't until the late 60s when they started establishing Nova Southeastern that they started building on that land. And if you actually look at a Google Maps, you look at College Avenue, there's part of it you'll still see part of that wagon wheel airfield and on that space. Yeah, so it's lots of interesting things there.
rattlesnakes here?
Of course, we're in the middle of the Everglades. Eastern diamondback rattlesnake. Not too long ago, there was a police officer who I think at a stop got bit by a rattlesnake. But
How did they establish the land, and was it under the Board of Education?
so the land for the school was actually donated by the Davies company, by the land sales company, to the Broward School Board. So it was donated to the school board at the time. So it was a part of the Broward County school system from when it was established, 1918. Yes.
When did the school close? When was the last year they actually had classes?
Yeah, so it was till 1978. It was the Davie School, and then it spent 2 years as Griffin Elementary as like a annex site. So we do have people who stop in who went there as the Griffin Elementary. But so 1980 was the last year it had school. Then it was school board offices, and so it was rugs down. There was a bunch of each of the rooms were split into office spaces with cubicles. It's very interesting to see the difference. And they considered tearing it down at one point, turning it into a bus depot. It just would have been very upsetting. But people in the community got together. The Davie Historical Society at the time, along with the Seroptimist International, which is a women's organization, made it their project to protect the school and have it listed on the National Register. So we are listed now, thankfully, and not going anywhere, knock on wood. So we'll see. But yeah, thank you guys very much. Yes?
What's the building made out?
It is poured concrete, so it is a sturdy structure. It was a hurricane shelter through all those years. And all three of these houses have made it through every hurricane since they were built, and largely because of their foundations went so deep. That's other families, when they came in, would build homes quickly, wouldn't make it through that storm. But thankfully these did. So yeah. So thank you all very much. I'll answer any other questions if you have them, but appreciate it. Thank you very much. So we should